Hey everyone, welcome back to Tax Fun with Taxium, the only podcast where tax talk is encouraged and sometimes even fun. I'm your host, Amanda, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Ronald, the guy who knows that sales tax isn't just something you slap on at checkout.
Slap it on everywhere. Before checkout, during, after, all the time. Tax is omnipresent.
I was waiting for that. It is omnipresent. It's everywhere. So today's topic is one that trips up.
Yeah.
Is one that trips up so many new and even seasoned business owners. Oh my goodness, it's definitely a Monday. I can feel it in my bones. We talked about tax filing and remittance in general, but today we're going specific sales tax filings. And I want you to really listen in because sales tax isn't just about collecting, it's about reporting and paying correctly on time and to the right place. So Ronald, get ready. I have a lot of questions for you today.
Let's do this.
All right. So first, let's clear the fog. What exactly is a sales tax return and how is it different from just collecting sales tax at the register or checkout page?
Yeah, good question. I heard you say the words filing and remittance earlier, and people tend to lump these things into the same kind of bucket, which, for all intents and purposes, they kind of are. But it's super important people understand each specific part of this process because it's twofold. So the first part is the filing itself, which this is the culmination of all the work people have done assessing tax transaction by transaction, line item by line item along the way for the previous month or previous period. This all comes to a head with the filing, which is all that information they've hopefully assessed properly being then depicted on these forms as information to the state on what their business did in that jurisdiction. So that's the filing part, is just getting all the information and making sure it's properly posted to the state. And then the remittance portion is the paying of the state. So yeah, we'll get more into that in a bit. But yeah, filing, just getting the numbers, paperwork, corralled, and then the remittance is the actual paying.
It's good to know that there's a difference between the two and they're not just interchangeable.
Yeah, and you definitely, as a business owner, you wouldn't want them to be. You wouldn't want to just have a number you pay, right? While it can be tedious to go through the process of doing the filings, you do learn a lot and you get visibility into what exactly your business is going to pay and why. So it's definitely something people should have, attentive eyes on.
Absolutely. So if I sell in more than one state, do I need to file sales tax returns in all of them? And how do I know which states I'm responsible for?
Yeah, great question. In general, it depends. The cadence of the filing is going to be based on the state. And whenever a business gets registered, the state's going to dictate that upon registration. They're going to tell you, great, Amanda's business, you told us you're doing $100,000 in sales. Great, you're going to be on a monthly filing calendar now. You're going to be on a quarterly. They'll tell that to you upon registration. And then if there's any changes in your filing frequency, they'll usually send you some kind of email or message through the DOR portal.
Right. I've had a lot of people ask me, can we just make this one quarterly? Mm-hmm. That is always determined by the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they can definitely ask and request, but nobody's going to force the states to do anything.
That's a funny joke.
Lots of those.
Is there a difference between filing and remitting in practice, or do most states treat them as just one transaction?
Yeah, from the states, it's kind of one process to them. You're supposed to file and remit at the same time. While technically you could do the filing and then pay later as a best practice, it's easier to just knock them both out at once. And so the state, they're not going to consider that filing complete until the payment's complete. So while they want the information to justify the payment, what they want the most is the payment, if it's due.
Absolutely. Okay, so now that we know what it is, let's talk timing. How often does a typical business need to file a sales tax return, which you've already answered because the short answer is it depends. Do you know what determines that frequency? Is it revenue, state, mood?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to re-answer the first part of that again. So, when they should do it or how they're supposed to know is, again, based on the state, but they should do it as often as the state tells them to. right? And we've seen lots of times where folks know they're supposed to do it monthly or quarterly, and they decide, well, I didn't make any sales this month, even though it's a monthly filing. I'm just going to skip this month because I didn't make sales. That's not a good thing to do. If the state tells you monthly, it's monthly until they tell you otherwise, and it's monthly independent of your sales dollars or volume.
Absolutely. And those $0 returns definitely
Mm-hmm.
count.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that was the first part of your question. What was the second part again?
What was the second part of my question?
That's
Does my mood help determine the
Oh yeah,
frequency?
how's it determined? So it's kind of a black box a little bit, but we've gotten some feedback from the various auditors and people we've talked to at different states. It could be partly based on revenue. It could be based on transaction amount. It could be based on that person's mood. We've seen times where folks will call and talk to somebody, explain their business model or something like, hey, you know what? We can adjust that to annually or semi-annually instead. No problem.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sometimes you get the difficult ones where you're already quarterly and they're going to move you to monthly just because.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about operationalizing this. And while some of these things can be an annoyance if you're doing this by hand, for the most part, these changes are a lot easier to absorb if you've got some kind of technology in place. Because then you're changing a setting from monthly to quarterly, and then you're done. You don't have to go and have somebody remember to do it by hand quarterly now instead of every month that they used to.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm selling on Etsy or Amazon and they collect the sales tax for me, do I still have to file?
Mm-hmm. You always have to file if you have Nexus in the state and you've been registered. So, independent of where you're selling, what channels, how much you're selling, how often you're selling, once you've registered and the state tells you file monthly, you file monthly. If you are selling on places like Etsy, Amazon, some of these marketplaces, definitely check out our last episode. I think it was about marketplaces. But
Mm-hmm.
just because Etsy and Amazon are paying the state the dollars on your behalf, that doesn't absolve your company of having to file a matching report indicating what sales your company did in that jurisdiction.
Absolutely. So in that case, what am I filing?
Yeah, great question. It depends on the state. A lot of them use the TAP system, which looks and feels pretty similar across all the states, but how states set it up can be a little bit different. So in some states like Indiana, you would file that marketplace under other for that. They call it an exemption reason why you're not paying tax on those dollars you put in the system. In other states, they have a field for marketplace. If you aren't sure, hop on Google, hop on the state's DOR website. Calling the state's the best option, but that may be a long hold time. Or if you're working with an outside provider like Taxim, we'll take care of that. But yeah, lots of nuance there, but make sure you're reporting it properly, because I've seen some folks, they're assuming that because the sale is quote unquote exempt, as in there's no tax because of whatever, it's a marketplace sale, and that's why there's no tax. They put it under the exempt field, which is not
Mm-hmm.
accurate, because an exempt sale requires an exempt buyer who provided you an exemption certificate. So if you put it in that field and it's filed wrong, then you get audited after the fact. It's going to be a very weird explanation how to say, well, I know I filed this as an exempt sale, but I don't have an exemption, so please forgive me. You don't want to be asking the piper forgiveness when the mistake was on your end.
Yeah, what's our tagline?
Yeah, say it again.
Not knowing is not an
Not an
excuse.
excuse.
So how do platforms like Shopify fit into this? Do they collect and remit for me, or is that still on me?
Yeah, we're starting to see lots of various platforms kind of dip their toes in the sales tax game. Before Shopify offloaded its calculation to Avalara, now they've got a partnership with Vertex. Now they're also doing Shopify tax. And I believe they're also able to remit the returns for people, not just the marketplace tax due through Shop, but actually file the returns like an Avalara or Vertex would. Same thing with Stripe and now TaxJar. They're kind of dipping their toes into that game. So folks kind of got to be aware of what these platforms can do, and then make sure they meet the short, medium, and long-term goals. Just because Shopify can file the returns doesn't mean it's going to work for your company, because what if you're selling
Mhm.
outside of Shopify? Just because Stripe could do the returns, again, doesn't mean it's going to work, because what if they don't support a state where you're filing in? So you just want to make sure that before you get in bed with any of these providers, they're going to meet the needs of the company, both today and moving forward.
Yeah, good point.
I got inspiration from Brittany. She knows all things.
Yeah, she's everything. We definitely love Brittany around here. Okay, so we both know tax trouble starts when people think I've got it under control and they don't. What are some of the biggest mistakes businesses make when it comes to filing their sales tax returns?
Yeah, not having a good understanding of their data and how to put it in the state forms. Depending on the number of transactions a company is doing, if you have 1, 10, 50 sales a month, pretty easy to understand what each sale was, how it fits in. Or if you're selling something that's the exact same every time you're selling one widget to a small number of customers, those filings are a lot easier. But as folks expand their lines of business, they sell across different systems. They sell to wholesale customers, to other businesses, people with one-time exemptions, partial exemptions, all these things. Their sales or invoicing system can process the individual sale easy enough, but trying to corral all this data and correlate across systems, across taxability settings for products, services, and customers, it becomes a lot. And that's why this is kind of the final test when it comes to sales tax and having done it right, because you're going to put this to paper now and you're going to affirm to the state this is all true and accurate, and hopefully it is, because you've got to put it down and hopefully you've got it right.
Yeah, absolutely. What happens if I file late, but I don't owe much or anything at all? Do I still get penalized?
Yeah, good question. So historically, penalties used to be a percentage, like a dollar percentage, a percentage of tax dollars. So if you were late on $1,000 filing, or if you had $1,000 in back taxes, there would be whatever it was, 8% interest, a 50% this charge, or whatever this charge. But lots of folks who didn't have any dollars due or sold to mostly exempt customers didn't have, dollars due, right? So percentage times zero was zero. Now some of the states in the search for revenue have gotten, I don't want to say smart to some of this. They've changed their tactics and methods. So now, in addition to the percentage-based filing penalties, there's now dollar-based. So you miss a filing, if it was zero, it could be a $25 penalty, $50, $100, and that's per occurrence, which that adds up.
Mm-hmm. What if I pay, but I forgot to file the return? Is that better or worse?
That's an interesting one. I haven't seen that happen. I've seen lots of times where people will file and not pay. But I guess in theory, if you don't file, the state could generate an estimated filing due. You could just blindly pay it. I definitely would not recommend doing that. If you miss the payment or the filing of the payment and their state's getting on to you about that, go back, look at your information, see what you owe, and pay them exactly what's owed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we've all seen it where we have the notices of you forgot to file, and then they estimate some outlandish number and people start losing their minds.
For sure. And I've talked to a few auditors. I've asked them, where did this number come from? And like you just said, it's kind of outlandish. And they're like, well, the system basically just kind of makes it up. But I'm like, based on what? Because they didn't pay this amount before, and they've tried to explain it. But basically, we look at historical this and try to, make a guess as to what it could have been and blah, blah, blah. But in the times that I've seen that estimated payment, once we went and actually did the correct, went and did the math for the filing, estimated payment's always way higher.
Way overstated.
Yeah, right. Which is probably the point. If you're gonna make the state come after you and ask for dollars, they're not gonna do the hard work for you and get it exactly right. They're just gonna way overestimate, and if you pay it, great for them.
Yeah. What if I completely forgot to file for a month? Do I fix it on the next return, or is that its own mess?
Great question. We see this a lot. And, folks are tinkerers. Once they get access to systems, we figure out how to make things work and do things our own way and maybe find some workarounds. The correct way to handle that would be to do a back filing or an amended return. which may cost folks some extra dollars or time. But if you made the sale last month or 2 months ago, it should be reported on that period's returns. While I've
Mhm.
definitely seen folks, roll things forward or put the sale on a future filing, uh, I always want to think about things in terms of audit, and you want things to be exactly right. So if they go looking for a sale, expecting it to have been in March, and your books show that it was on the June filing, it may just raise some additional questions that you don't want to have to go through.
Right. Keep it as clean
Absolutely,
as
yeah.
possible.
It's like we're growing up. You keep your room clean, your parents yell at you less. The messier the room
Yeah.
is, the more we get picked out about stuff.
Not in my case. Sorry, mom.
Is she listening?
Maybe.
Hey, Mom.
Okay, here's the nightmare fuel. What happens if I collect sales tax from customers but never remit it to the
Mm,
state? What are the consequences?
yeah, big and bad. That's a big no-no. I don't want to scare people because this stuff happens all the time. There's a lot going on with tax and technology. They don't always know, but absolutely massive deal. The states do not want you collecting their dollars and not giving them back to them. So if you see that's happening, run to the nearest consultant, Taxium, your internal tax person, whoever it is, and talk about this, because it's basically hot potato. Right. It's the ticking
Hmm.
time bomb waiting to go off. Only question is going to be when it goes off and how much damage it causes. But you absolutely cannot sit on sales tax dollars and not remit them to the state. If you're registered, you should be assessing and remitting. And then if you collect, you got to pay it. If you're not registered, you should not be assessing, collecting, or remitting. So
Yeah.
there's not really any excuse for why somebody would be collecting tax dollars and not giving them back. Because, like our tagline, not knowing is not an excuse, and you just shouldn't be collecting tax dollars willy nilly.
Yeah. And let's just call it what it is. It's tax
Yeah.
fraud.
And that's the big scary term. And it doesn't matter if it's intentional or not. You may get
Hmm.
lucky and get some mercy from the auditor, or you may not. It's not a position you want to be in to need that mercy. So just make sure your stuff is clean.
Right. Are there any states that are more aggressive about sales tax enforcement than others?
Absolutely, but not something businesses should necessarily worry about. Their sales tax process, how they operationalize this, should be consistent across the board. So if you're doing things the right way every single time, you're not really worried about as many of the trying to figure out which states you might can play in the gray or get away with some stuff. Even though Washington's trickier than others, most of these states work in similar enough ways to where if you get a good process in place, you're going to be good.
Right. And to touch on something that we went over a little bit earlier, can businesses get audited just for sales tax issues and what triggers that?
Yeah, they can get audited for all kinds of reasons. Sales tax is one of them. What triggers it? Who the heck knows? One of those black boxes. And we got to invite some of the auditors we know to come talk about that. But I've heard all kinds of various things. One of the easy ways, especially for businesses that have employees in the state, if they have an employee, they're supposed to be registered with the Secretary of State. And so the Department of Revenue, they get lists showing who's registered in what other departments they compare. If you have physical presence through that employee, you should be registered for sales tax. If you're not, easy way to see it, they come knocking on the door. That's one way, when people connected to you get audited, your business can get audited. So one of your vendors, suppliers, customers get audited. They're checking their transactions. They happen to see your company's name. Boom, here's an audit for you too. We've seen folks get audited because they're filing payments and amounts, look different over time. They went from selling massive amounts, remitting massive dollars, to it drop to 20% of that. And the state's like, hey, what happened? Are you just reporting less or are you actually selling and doing less business? So
Hmm.
yeah, but in either case, you probably can't avoid the audit ever. You can't avoid those difficult states. What you can do is have your house in order. So when that time knock on the door comes, you're ready for that inspection.
Absolutely. So, what are some practical tools or software that you would recommend to keep track of sales tax collection, filing, and remittance?
That's going to vary per business and per use case. If folks are looking to explore software to automate this, the first call should be somebody who knows all the various vendors. Talk to us at Taxium. If you don't want to talk to us, no problem. Talk to your other friends who are, CFOs or in accounting at other companies. Ask what they're using. Go search the internet. But you should have a good feel for what you want the thing to do for you, both short, medium, and long term, before you go shopping for it. Because they're all going to tell you, we can do this and do this and do that and buy us and buy that. But, you've really got to know what you're looking for, and that'll help you kind of weed some of them out.
Yeah. And how would you recommend a brand new business get started with this? What are their first steps?
To automating sales tax?
Yes.
Yeah. The journey we kind of see is that folks, they start off pretty small, maybe doing sales tax in a state or two. They're going to get to a point where it's too much work for one person to handle. And that's probably the time they want to explore using software to make up some of that difference. But once you get to that point, definitely talk to us or somebody like us so we can help you make streamline this. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say a business starting on day one needs a big process and big software. But just they should keep in mind that as they grow, they're going to need to invest one way or the other, either by hiring more people to manage this stuff or leveraging technology. In our experience, it's almost always more cost effective to leverage technology, let it do most of the work. But that'll be, business by business, and they'll know when the time is right, when it becomes too much work for somebody.
Right. Should every business have a separate bank account for just tax remittance to avoid accidentally spending what they owe?
Good question. Personal preference. Yeah. If people have other processes and ways to track stuff, then no problem. No problem. Either way works. But it all goes back to how they put these processes in place, as they grow. It should be the same for all the states in every case, but no answer is wrong. Just make sure you're doing it the same every time as you grow to keep it consistent.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk hiring. When should a business bring in a bookkeeper and an accountant to handle sales tax specifically?
Ooh, interesting. There definitely would need to be involved in the process. And going back to the software side, if a business is considering bringing somebody to handle something like sales tax, somebody who doesn't have specific high-end expertise, they should maybe find some alternate ways to fix that problem. Because tax is so nuanced that while lots of people are familiar with and may touch tax in various roles, that's much different than managing tax across jurisdictions, across products, services, buyers, all the things, across software, automating it. It's a whole lot involved. So if a business is getting to the point where they're thinking about getting some outside help, like a bookkeeper come in to do sales tax, they could probably take those same dollars, maybe even less dollars, and go get software that's going to do it much more reliably and probably more accurately and consistently.
Yeah, more efficiently,
Yeah,
faster.
for sure.
Automate where you can, right? Okay, Ronald, I think I grilled you enough for one episode. Topic's one of those you don't know what you know situations. Once you're aware of the moving parts, collection, filing, remittance, deadlines, state rules, it gets easier to build good habits and avoid costly mistakes. If you're listening and feeling overwhelmed, take heart. This is one of the most common areas where businesses need help. You're not behind. You're just learning. And now, you know what we've got to end with. Why did the small business owner refuse to play hide and seek?
Because they were hiding from their taxes instead?
Because every time they hid, the state found their unfiled sales tax returns.
Yeah, absolutely. The states, they seem to be better at things that involve them getting money. They're always not so great at, getting stuff done for the population and communities. But when it comes to them collecting that money, man, they are good.
Yeah, you're not wrong. They'll never come at you if you overpay. But if you underpay by 2 cents, they're on you.
Uncle Sam needs that money.
Well, that's all for today's episode of Tax Fun with Taxium. Be sure to follow, leave a review, and maybe even forward this episode to someone who just started an online shop and thinks sales tax is just a couple of clicks. Until next time, file on time and stay fine.
Stay fine. Try. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Do, 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 do.